You found your way here and clicked on this video. Thank you. Welcome to Sleepy Time Design, the home of gentle design trivia to go to sleep to. This is a quiet place for slowing down at the end of the day. You may let the sound play and rest as you are, without expectation, without worry. You may gently listen with peace, knowing that you are about to sink and relax into this subtle, sleepy story. Brand identity facts to fall asleep to. Let's begin. Brand identity facts. The foundation of recognition. Brand identity exists in the world, whether anyone plans for it or not. It forms in the space between intention and perception, in the accumulation of what appears and reappears. Something presents itself consistently over time, and in that consistency, an identity takes shape. It includes what is seen, what is heard, what settles into memory without announcement. The identity simply is, built from the materials of repetition and presence. People often recognize an identity before they understand what it means. There is a moment of sensing before knowing, a flicker of familiarity that arrives ahead of comprehension. The mind notices patterns, registers the recurring elements, and files them away in some quiet corner of awareness. Recognition happens in that dim space where attention is not required, where the effort of noticing has been replaced by the ease of already knowing. A shape appears, a color returns, a rhythm repeats, and the mind says, "This again." Not with excitement, not with analysis, just with the small comfort of the familiar. Familiarity builds recognition, the way water smooths stone slowly, persistently, without drama. What was once new becomes known. What was once effortful becomes automatic. The mind stops working to identify and simply identifies. This is the gift of repetition. It removes the burden of constant interpretation. The same elements appear in the same configurations, and the brain begins to predict their presence before they fully arrive. Recognition becomes a reflex, a background process that requires no conscious participation. Repetition helps identity settle into the background of daily life. It does not demand to be seen. It simply continues to appear. The logo on the package, the color on the sign, the typeface on the label. These things repeat until they no longer feel like choices, but like facts. They become part of the landscape, elements of the environment that exist without needing to announce themselves. Identity recedes from the foreground, from the place where decisions are made and attention is allocated, and takes up residence in the peripheral vision of consciousness. It is there, reliably there, without insisting on being noticed. Identity can feel steady without being noticed at all. It operates in the realm of the unexamined, the taken for granted, the simply present. There is no fanfare, no call for acknowledgement. It exists in the same way that furniture exists, in a familiar room, solid, dependable, rarely considered. The steadiness itself becomes a kind of communication, a message delivered not through words, but through constancy. Day after day, week after week, the same elements return. They do not shift or surprise. They hold their ground, and in that holding, something is conveyed. This is what this is. This is how this appears. This is the shape it takes in the world. Consistency creates reliability, and reliability becomes the foundation on which quiet trust is built. When something appears the same way repeatedly, the mind begins to relax around it. There is no need to reevaluate, no need to recalibrate expectations. The pattern has been established, and the pattern holds. This reliability does not announce itself as trustworthiness, does not make claims about character or intention. It simply shows up, again and again, in the same form. And the mind, encountering the sameness, begins to assume it will continue. Trust forms in that assumption, in the belief that tomorrow will resemble today, that the next encounter will echo the last. It is a trust built on observation rather than promise, on evidence rather than declaration. Visual elements form one part of this identity, one strand in a larger weave. Color becomes associated with a brand not through a single exposure, but through countless small encounters. The blue of a package, the red of a logo, the green of a storefront. These hues accumulate in memory, linking themselves to the thing they represent. Over time, the color itself becomes a shorthand, a quick reference that bypasses language and lands directly in recognition. The mind sees the blue and thinks, that one. Not through effort, not through conscious recall, but through the simple association that repetition has forged. Typography also signals identity, though its work is often quieter than colors. The shape of letters, the weight of strokes, the spacing between characters, these details speak in a language that few consciously read, but many unconsciously feel. A typeface can feel formal or casual, modern or traditional, playful or serious. It carries tone without uttering a word, and when the same typeface appears consistently, it becomes another thread in the fabric of identity, another element that contributes to the overall sense of what something is and how it wishes to be known. Shapes, too, can feel familiar over time. The curve of a logo, the proportion of a container, the outline of an icon, these forms settle into the visual memory and become markers of recognition. A shape does not need to be complex to be effective. It simply needs to repeat. The mind is remarkably good at learning shapes, at storing them in its vast catalog of forms, and retrieving them when needed. A familiar shape appears, and recognition follows, swift and certain, requiring no translation or interpretation. Even spacing contributes to recognition, though it is perhaps the most invisible of all identity elements. The distance between letters, the margins around images, the breathing room between elements, these spatial relationships create rhythm and balance. They influence how something feels to look at, how the eye moves across a surface, how much effort is required to parse information. Consistent spacing becomes part of the visual signature, another subtle cue that helps the mind identify what it is seeing. The identity builds itself from these layers: color, type, shape, space, each element contributing to a whole that is greater than the sum of its parts, each repetition strengthening the structure that holds it all together. So the identity accumulates quietly, built from layers of visual consistency and repeated presence. It asks nothing of the viewer, demands no active participation, requires no effort beyond the passive act of encountering what appears. Color, typography, shape, spacing, these elements arrange themselves into patterns that the mind learns without trying to learn them. Familiarity arrives through repetition, recognition through familiarity, and trust through the steady reliability of what returns again and again in the same form. The identity settles into the background of awareness, becoming part of the landscape rather than a feature that demands attention. It holds its position through constancy rather than novelty, through predictability rather than surprise. And in that quiet holding, in that unannounced steadiness, the identity establishes itself as something known, something that can be counted on to appear as it has always appeared, to remain as it has always remained. The foundation is laid not through declaration but through demonstration, not through claims but through the simple evidence of continued presence. The identity exists because it persists, and it persists by remaining recognizably itself, building through repetition. Tone of voice influences perception in ways that operate beneath the surface of conscious awareness. A brand speaks, and in the speaking, it reveals something about its character. The tone might feel calm, energetic, or neutral. It might suggest formality or ease, precision or warmth. These qualities emerge not from what is said, but from how it is said, the cadence, the word choices, the rhythm of sentences. Tone carries information that bypasses rational analysis and lands directly in the emotional centers of understanding. It shapes how a message is received before the content of the message is even fully processed. Identity is shaped by choices made repeatedly, by the small decisions that accumulate into a recognizable whole. Each time a color is selected, a typeface is used, a phrase is written, a choice is made. And when these choices align, when they echo one another across different contexts and moments, they begin to form a pattern. The pattern becomes the identity. It is not any single choice that creates this effect, but the relationship between choices, the way they speak to one another, and reinforce a common thread. A brand becomes itself through this ongoing process of selection and repetition, through the steady accumulation of aligned decisions. Small choices matter when they are consistent. A single use of a particular blue might go unnoticed, but when that blue appears again and again on packaging, on signage, in digital spaces, it becomes significant. The smallness of the choice does not diminish its impact when it is repeated. In fact, it is often the smallest choices that accumulate most powerfully, precisely because they operate below the threshold of conscious attention. The viewer does not stop to think about the blue. They simply see it, register it, file it away. And with each encounter, the association strengthens. The blue becomes linked to the brand, not through any single dramatic gesture, but through patient, persistent presence. Consistency reduces cognitive effort, and this reduction is itself a form of kindness. The mind is constantly working to make sense of the world, to sort and categorize and interpret the flood of information it encounters. When something appears consistently, the mind can stop working so hard. It has already done the work of identification. It does not need to do it again. The familiar logo, the expected color, the recognizable typeface, these things allow the brain to conserve its resources, to move quickly past the question of, what is this? And toward other matters. Consistency is a gift to the tired mind, a small mercy in a world that demands constant interpretation. Logos are symbols used for identification, marks that stand in for the larger entity they represent. They function as shorthand, visual abbreviations that compress a brand's identity into a single, recognizable form. A logo does not need to explain everything about what it represents. It does not need to tell the whole story or communicate every value. Its job is simpler: to be recognizable, to serve as a reliable point of reference, to anchor identity in a form that can be quickly perceived and remembered. The logo is a flag planted in the landscape of commerce and culture, a marker that says, this is where this thing is, this is what it looks like. Simplicity often improves recall because it reduces the burden of memory. A simple form is easier to store, easier to retrieve, easier to reproduce in the mind's eye. The brain favors efficiency, and efficiency favors simplicity. A logo with fewer elements, a color palette with fewer hues, a design system with fewer variables. These simplified approaches make the work of remembering easier. They create clear, uncluttered impressions that lodge themselves firmly in memory. There is nothing extraneous to forget, nothing unnecessary to filter out. What remains is pure signal, stripped of noise. Complex marks require more attention, more effort to parse and understand. They present the viewer with a puzzle that must be solved, a visual problem that demands cognitive resources. In some contexts, this complexity serves a purpose. It conveys sophistication, richness, depth. But in the realm of identity, where the goal is recognition rather than contemplation, complexity can work against itself. The more intricate the mark, the more difficult it becomes to remember accurately, to recall in detail, to identify at a glance. The mind must work harder to process what it sees, and that extra work can slow recognition, can introduce friction into what should be a smooth, automatic process. Many strong identities use limited elements, building their visual systems from a constrained set of materials. A single typeface, a few core colors, a handful of shapes. These elements repeat and recombine, creating variation within a narrow range. The limitation itself becomes a defining characteristic, a signature of the identity. It signals discipline, intentionality, focus, and practically, it makes the identity easier to maintain, easier to apply consistently across different contexts, easier for audiences to learn and remember. Fewer elements mean fewer opportunities for inconsistency, fewer variables to track and control. Fewer elements are easier to remember because memory has limits, and those limits favor simplicity. The human brain can hold only so much information in active recall. When an identity presents fewer distinct elements, it fits more comfortably within these cognitive constraints. The viewer can grasp the whole system without strain, can internalize the key components without effort. The identity becomes portable, something that can be carried in the mind and recognized instantly when encountered in the world. This ease of memory translates directly into strength of recognition, into the speed and certainty with which an identity is identified. Identity can be built quietly over time, without fanfare or announcement. It does not require a grand unveiling or a dramatic debut. It can simply begin to appear, to show up consistently in the places where it belongs, to establish itself through steady presence rather than spectacular entrance. This quiet building has its own power, a cumulative force that grows stronger with each repetition. The identity becomes part of the environment gradually, seeping into awareness rather than bursting into it. And in that gradual emergence, there is a kind of naturalness, a sense that the identity has always been there, waiting to be noticed. So, the identity takes shape through deliberate choices repeated consistently, through the patient layering of visual and tonal elements that align with one another. Simplicity aids memory, consistency reduces effort, and repetition builds the familiarity that makes recognition effortless. The logos, colors, typefaces, and shapes that comprise an identity work together as a system, each element supporting the others, each repetition strengthening the whole. Small choices accumulate into significant patterns, and those patterns become the substance of identity itself. The brand speaks through its tone reveals itself through its visual language and establishes itself through the quiet discipline of showing up the same way again and again. What begins as a collection of individual decisions becomes, over time, a unified presence, something recognizable, something known, something that exists in the world with clarity and constancy. The power of familiarity. Recognition can happen subconsciously, in the depths of awareness where deliberate thought does not reach. The mind processes far more information than it brings to conscious attention. It scans, sorts, compares, and identifies without announcing these operations to the self. A logo appears in peripheral vision, a color flashes past on a moving vehicle, a typeface registers on a distant sign, and somewhere in the cognitive background, recognition occurs. The viewer may not be able to articulate what they saw, may not even remember having seen it, but the brain has done its work nonetheless. The identity has been registered, the pattern has been matched, the connection has been made. This subconscious recognition accumulates over time, building a foundation of familiarity that exists beneath the surface of explicit memory. People often sense familiarity before they can name it. There is a feeling that arrives ahead of identification, a vague sense of having encountered something before. The mind knows before it knows that it knows. This precognitive familiarity is powerful precisely because it bypasses skepticism and analysis. It feels like intuition, like a direct knowing that requires no justification. When an identity triggers this sense of familiarity, it benefits from the positive associations that come with recognition, the comfort of the known, the ease of the expected. The viewer feels oriented, grounded, connected to something they have encountered before, even if they cannot immediately recall where or when. Identity does not rely on novelty to be effective. In fact, novelty can work against the goals of identity, which are recognition and consistency rather than surprise and innovation. An identity that constantly reinvents itself never gives audiences the chance to learn it, to internalize its patterns, to build the mental shortcuts that make recognition effortless. The power of identity lies in its repeatability, in its willingness to be the same thing over and over again. This sameness is not a failure of creativity. It is a strategic choice, a recognition that the work of identity is to be known, not to be new. Brand identity differs from branding actions in fundamental ways. Branding actions are the things that happen, the campaigns, the launches, the communications, the events. They are active, time-bound, intentional. Brand identity, by contrast, is what remains when all that activity pauses. It is the residue of those actions, the impression they leave behind. Identity exists in the quiet spaces between campaigns, in the moments when nothing is being actively promoted or announced. It is the steady state, the baseline, the thing that persists regardless of what else is happening. While branding actions create energy and attention, brand identity creates continuity and recognition. Identity exists between interactions, in the gaps and pauses where no active communication is taking place. It lives in memory, in the associations that have already been formed, in the expectations that have already been set. When a person thinks about a brand without being prompted, without seeing an advertisement or receiving a message, they are accessing its identity. That mental representation, the colors they picture, the feelings they associate, the words they would use to describe it is the identity at work. It operates independently of any specific moment of contact, existing as a stable reference point in the landscape of memory and association. Silence can be part of identity, not as absence, but as presence. The choice not to speak constantly, not to fill every moment with communication, can itself communicate something meaningful. Silence suggests confidence, restraint, respect for the audience's attention. It creates space for what has already been said to settle and be absorbed. In a world where noise is constant and messages are relentless, silence becomes distinctive. An identity that knows when to be quiet, when to hold back, when to trust that it has already been established. This identity demonstrates a kind of maturity, a comfort with itself that does not require constant reinforcement. Restraint can feel intentional, can signal thoughtfulness and discipline. An identity that uses fewer colors, fewer words, fewer decorative elements is making a choice. The restraint is visible, or rather, it is felt in the spaciousness that results from it. There is room to breathe, room for the essential elements to be clearly perceived, room for the viewer to engage without feeling overwhelmed. This restraint suggests that every element present has been carefully considered, that nothing is there by accident or excess. It conveys a sense of control, of purposefulness, of an identity that knows exactly what it is and needs nothing extra to prove it. Identity can feel stable without being loud. Stability does not require volume or insistence. It comes from consistency, from the reliable presence of the same elements in the same relationships. A stable identity does not shout for attention. It simply remains in place, available to be recognized whenever it is encountered. This quiet stability can be more powerful than flashy prominence because it builds trust gradually, through repeated demonstrations of reliability rather than through bold claims. The identity becomes something that can be counted on, something that holds its position in the changing landscape of culture and commerce. Predictability can be comforting in ways that are easy to underestimate. In a world characterized by constant change and uncertainty, there is genuine value in things that remain the same. When an identity is predictable, when it looks and sounds and feels the way it always has, it offers a small anchor of consistency. The viewer knows what to expect, and that knowing brings a subtle ease. There is no surprise to navigate, no adjustment to make, no recalibration required. The familiar identity appears, and with it comes the comfort of recognition, the quiet pleasure of encountering something that behaves exactly as expected. This predictability does not bore, it reassures. Comfort supports long-term trust because trust is built through repeated positive experiences over time. Each encounter with a consistent identity adds another data point to the internal ledger the mind keeps. The identity showed up as expected. It looked the way it was supposed to look. It behaved the way it has always behaved. These small confirmations accumulate, building a sense that this identity is reliable, that it can be trusted to remain itself. The trust is not dramatic or explicit. It is ambient, a background assumption that grows stronger with each unremarkable confirmation. And this quiet trust becomes the foundation for ongoing relationship, for the willingness to return, to engage, to maintain connection over months and years. So, recognition happens in layers, some conscious and some not, some immediate and some delayed. Familiarity arrives before naming, and that precognitive sense of knowing creates comfort and ease. The identity establishes itself not through novelty, but through patient repetition, not through constant activity, but through what persists in the quiet spaces between actions. Silence and restraint become part of the language, communicating through what is not said as much as through what is. Stability offers anchor, predictability offers comfort, and that comfort builds the trust that sustains connection across time. The identity holds its ground, remains recognizable, continues to be itself, and in that continued being, it creates the conditions for lasting recognition and relationship. Trust through steadiness. Trust develops gradually, not through sudden revelation, but through the slow accumulation of consistent experience. It cannot be demanded or manufactured in a moment. Trust forms as the mind observes patterns over time, as it notes that what appeared yesterday appears again today, that what was true last month remains true this month. Each encounter adds evidence. Each repetition strengthens the case. The mind begins to rely on what it has observed, to build expectations based on past performance, to assume continuity. This gradual development is trust's natural rhythm. It grows at the pace of experience, deepening with each confirmation that the pattern holds. Gradual change feels safer than abrupt change because the mind can track it, can adjust incrementally rather than all at once. When an identity shifts slowly, it gives audiences time to acclimate, to update their mental models without discarding them entirely. The core remains recognizable, even as details evolve. There is continuity within the change, a thread that connects past to present to future. But when change arrives suddenly, without preparation or transition, it breaks the pattern abruptly. The familiar becomes unfamiliar in an instant, and the mind must scramble to reconcile what it knew with what it now sees. This abruptness creates disorientation, a momentary loss of bearings that can undermine the trust that gradual familiarity has built. Brand identity includes emotional tone, a quality that colors every interaction and shapes how the identity is experienced. This tone might be warm or cool, serious or playful, formal or casual. It exists in the spaces between words, in the feeling that accompanies visual elements, in the overall atmosphere that an identity creates. Emotional tone is not separate from the visual and verbal elements. It emerges from them, from the choices made about color and type and language and imagery. A brand with a warm emotional tone feels welcoming, approachable, human. One with a cool tone feels precise, professional, restrained. The tone sets expectations about what kind of relationship is on offer, what kind of interaction is anticipated. Emotional tone can be subtle, operating at frequencies that are felt rather than explicitly noticed. It does not announce itself with declarations or explanations. Instead, it pervades the identity, infusing every element with a particular quality of feeling. The viewer absorbs this tone without necessarily being able to articulate it, without consciously analyzing what creates the feeling they experience. They simply sense it, a warmth, a distance, an energy, a calm. This subtlety makes emotional tone powerful. It works beneath the radar of critical thinking, shaping perception and response at a level that feels instinctive rather than calculated. Not all identity is expressive. Some identities choose neutrality, restraint, understatement. They do not seek to evoke strong emotions or project bold personalities. Instead, they aim for clarity, functionality, reliability. These neutral identities serve their purpose through what they do not do as much as through what they do. They do not distract, do not demand, do not perform. They simply present themselves clearly and step back, allowing the product or service or content to take center stage. This neutrality is itself a choice, a deliberate positioning that values transparency and directness over personality and flair. Neutral identities still communicate values, even in their restraint. The choice of neutrality says something about priorities, that substance matters more than style, that function supersedes decoration, that clarity trumps cleverness. A neutral identity suggests confidence that does not need ornamentation, quality that speaks for itself, an approach that respects the audience's intelligence and time. The restraint communicates respect, the simplicity communicates focus, the neutrality communicates seriousness of purpose. Values are transmitted not through explicit statements, but through the consistent application of these principles across every touchpoint. Calm identities often rely on steadiness as their primary strategy. They do not chase trends or respond to every shift in cultural attention. They hold their position, maintain their approach, trust that consistency will serve them better than constant adaptation. This steadiness itself becomes reassuring, a signal that the brand knows who it is and does not need external validation or approval. In a landscape of constant flux, where identities often scramble to remain relevant or eye-catching, the calm identity simply continues being what it has always been. There is strength in this refusal to be shaken, power in this commitment to consistency. Visual noise can weaken recognition by introducing elements that compete for attention and muddy the clarity of the identity. When too many colors appear, when too many typefaces are used, when too many shapes and patterns and decorative flourishes crowd the visual field, the mind struggles to identify what is essential. The signal gets lost in the noise. Recognition requires clear patterns, distinct markers that can be quickly identified and remembered. When the identity is cluttered with unnecessary elements, those patterns become harder to discern. The viewer must work to separate what matters from what doesn't, and that work slows recognition, introduces friction, weakens the immediate connection that a clear identity creates. Clarity supports recall because the mind remembers what it can clearly perceive. A clean, uncluttered identity leaves a clean, uncluttered impression in memory. There is no confusion about what the key elements are, no ambiguity about what defines the identity. The essential components stand out, unobscured by extraneous details. When the viewer later tries to recall the identity, they can access these clear impressions easily. The memory is sharp rather than fuzzy, specific rather than vague. This clarity of recall translates directly into strength of recognition. The identity can be identified quickly and confidently because it has been perceived and stored clearly in the first place. Identity works best when it feels natural, when it seems to arise organically from what the brand is rather than being imposed artificially from outside. There is a quality of rightness, of fittingness, when an identity aligns with the substance it represents. The visual and verbal elements feel appropriate, proportional, honest. They do not overpromise or misrepresent. They do not strain for effects that the underlying reality cannot support. Instead, they reflect and reveal, presenting the brand in a way that feels authentic and unforced. This naturalness creates coherence between expectation and experience, between the identity's promises and the brand's delivery. And that coherence builds trust because it demonstrates integrity, a correspondence between how something presents itself and what it actually is. So, trust accumulates through gradual, consistent experience, through changes that feel manageable rather than disruptive. Emotional tone infuses the identity with feeling, whether bold or subtle, expressive or neutral, and that tone communicates values, even in restraint. Calm identities find power in steadiness, in the refusal to be swayed by every passing trend. Visual noise weakens recognition, while clarity strengthens it, making the identity easier to perceive, remember, and recall. And when the identity feels natural, when it aligns with the substance beneath it, it creates the coherence that allows trust to deepen and recognition to become not just automatic, but genuinely meaningful. The identity settles into place, finds its proper expression, and holds that position with quiet confidence. Flexible coherence. Forced consistency can feel rigid, can create an identity that seems more concerned with rules than with resonance. When consistency is pursued too strictly, without allowance for context or natural variation, it begins to feel mechanical. The identity loses the subtle flexibility that makes it feel human, alive, responsive. Every application looks identical. Every expression follows the exact same formula, and in that perfect uniformity, something vital drains away. The identity becomes a template rather than a living system, a set of constraints rather than a coherent whole. It follows the letter of its own law, but loses the spirit that gave those guidelines meaning in the first place. Flexible consistency feels human because it acknowledges that context matters, that different situations call for different expressions while still maintaining a recognizable core. The identity adapts without losing itself, bends without breaking, responds to circumstances while preserving its essential character. A color palette might shift slightly to suit different materials or lighting conditions. A layout might adjust to accommodate different content needs. A tone of voice might modulate for different audiences or occasions. These variations do not undermine consistency. They demonstrate it at a deeper level, showing that the identity is secure enough in itself to allow for natural adaptation. The consistency lies in the underlying principles rather than in rigid adherence to surface details. Identity is shaped by context, existing not in isolation but in relationship to its surroundings. The same logo appears different against a white background than against black. The same message lands differently in a moment of crisis than in a moment of celebration. The same color feels different in a physical space than on a screen. Context influences how identity is perceived, what aspects of it become prominent, what associations it triggers. An identity cannot control its context, but it can be designed with contextual flexibility in mind, with an understanding that it will appear in varied circumstances and must remain recognizable across all of them. Context influences interpretation in ways that are sometimes subtle, sometimes profound. A formal typeface might feel authoritative in one setting and stuffy in another. A bright color might feel energetic in one context and frivolous in another. The same words might communicate confidence or arrogance depending on when and where they appear. The identity itself has not changed, but the meaning that audiences extract from it shifts with the situation. This contextual sensitivity means that identity cannot be understood as a fixed thing with fixed meanings. It is dynamic, responsive to the environments in which it appears, shaped by the associations and expectations that those environments activate. The same identity can feel different in different settings, revealing different facets of itself depending on where it appears. In a retail environment, it might emphasize accessibility and warmth. In a corporate report, it might emphasize professionalism and credibility. In a social media post, it might emphasize personality and approachability. These are not contradictions, but dimensions, aspects of a multifaceted identity that come forward or recede, depending on what the situation calls for. The identity contains all these possibilities, and context determines which aspects become most visible in any given moment. Consistent cues help bridge contexts, providing threads of continuity that connect disparate experiences. When certain elements remain constant, a signature color, a distinctive typeface, a particular logo placement, they create coherence across different settings. The viewer encounters the identity in a store, on a website, in an email, on packaging, and each time, these consistent cues trigger recognition. They signal, "This is the same thing you encountered before." Despite the different contexts, despite the varied applications, the core identity remains identifiable. These cues function as anchor points, stable references that help the mind connect experiences that might otherwise feel unrelated. Identity benefits from repetition without variation overload. Repetition builds recognition, but too much variation within that repetition can undermine the pattern the mind is trying to learn. If the logo appears in a different color every time, if the typeface changes from application to application, if the tone shifts dramatically from message to message, the mind cannot establish a clear pattern. There is repetition, but it is repetition of difference rather than repetition of sameness. The identity needs enough variation to remain interesting and contextually appropriate, but not so much variation that it becomes unrecognizable. The balance between repetition and variation is delicate, requiring careful calibration to ensure that consistency registers without rigidity setting in. Change within boundaries feels stable because the boundaries themselves provide reassurance. An identity can evolve, can introduce new elements, or retire old ones, can adjust its expression to suit changing times, as long as it does so within established parameters. The core elements remain recognizable, the fundamental character stays intact, and the changes feel like natural growth rather than arbitrary reinvention. The boundaries define what is essential, what must be preserved for the identity to remain itself. Within those boundaries, there is room for movement, for adaptation, for the small shifts that keep an identity feeling current without making it feel unfamiliar. Boundaries create coherence by defining what belongs and what does not, what fits within the identity and what falls outside it. They provide structure, a framework within which all the various expressions and applications can find their place. Without boundaries, an identity risks becoming diffuse, spreading in too many directions, losing the focus that makes it recognizable. The boundaries might be visual, these colors, but not those, this style of imagery, but not that. They might be tonal, this kind of language, but not that. This emotional register, but not another. Whatever their specific nature, these boundaries serve the same function. They concentrate the identity, keeping it coherent and recognizable by excluding what does not serve its essential character. Coherence reduces uncertainty because it provides a clear, consistent picture of what something is. When an identity is coherent, when all its elements align and support one another, audiences can form stable expectations. They know what they are dealing with, what to anticipate, how to relate. This knowledge reduces the cognitive uncertainty that comes from encountering something ambiguous or contradictory. The mind does not have to work to reconcile conflicting signals or puzzle out inconsistencies. Everything fits together, makes sense, presents a unified whole. And in that unity, there is comfort, the comfort of understanding, of clarity, of a world that behaves predictably and can therefore be navigated with confidence. So, consistency finds its most effective expression not in rigidity, but in thoughtful flexibility, in an identity that can adapt to context while maintaining its essential character. The same identity reveals different aspects of itself in different settings, connected by consistent cues that bridge these varied experiences. Repetition builds recognition, but only when it avoids the variation overload that prevents patterns from forming. Change happens within boundaries that preserve coherence, that keep the identity recognizably itself even as it evolves. And coherence itself reduces the uncertainty that makes interaction effortful, creating instead a sense of clarity and stability that allows trust to deepen and relationship to flourish. The identity holds its center while allowing its edges to flex, remaining constant in its core while responsive in its expression. Patterns and expectations. Reduced uncertainty feels reassuring because the mind expends considerable energy managing what it does not know. Every ambiguous signal, every inconsistent element, every unexpected variation requires cognitive resources to process and interpret. When an identity reduces this uncertainty through consistency and clarity, it performs a quiet service. The mind can relax its vigilance, can lower the effort it devotes to figuring things out. What appears is what was expected, and that alignment between expectation and reality brings a subtle ease. The reassurance is not dramatic. There are no grand gestures or explicit promises, but it accumulates, building a foundation of comfort that supports continued engagement. Reassurance builds familiarity through the mechanism of positive repetition. Each time an expectation is met, each time the identity appears as anticipated, the sense of familiarity deepens. The mind notes, yes, this again. The pattern holds. What was predicted has occurred. This confirmation strengthens the mental model, makes the identity more firmly established in memory, increases the likelihood of future recognition. Familiarity grows not from novelty, but from sameness, not from surprise, but from the satisfying confirmation that what was known remains knowable. The identity becomes increasingly familiar with each unremarkable fulfillment of expectation. Brand identity develops through observation, through the passive accumulation of impressions that audiences gather over time. People do not study brand identities the way they might study for an exam. They simply encounter them in stores, on streets, in media, in the routine flow of daily life. Each encounter deposits another impression, another data point. The mind observes without trying to observe, registers without deciding to register. The identity reveals itself gradually through these repeated exposures, building its presence in consciousness, not through active learning, but through passive absorption. What is seen, often enough, eventually becomes known. Audiences notice patterns over time, even when they are not consciously looking for them. The human brain is built to detect patterns. It is one of the mind's fundamental operations, happening constantly in the background of awareness. Colors that appear together repeatedly, shapes that recur, words that are used consistently, these patterns register whether or not anyone is paying deliberate attention. The mind automatically seeks order, looks for repetition, identifies what is stable across changing circumstances. An identity that provides clear patterns makes this work easy, giving the brain exactly what it is already inclined to look for: reliable signals that can be recognized and remembered. Patterns create expectations because the mind assumes that what has happened before will happen again. When a logo has always appeared in blue, the expectation forms that it will continue to appear in blue. When a brand has always used a certain tone, the expectation develops that future messages will carry that same tone. These expectations are not conscious predictions. They are automatic assumptions formed through pattern recognition. The mind extrapolates from past experience, projecting forward what it has learned. And when an identity provides consistent patterns, these expectations become stable, reliable, useful guides to what will come next. Meeting expectations builds trust because it demonstrates reliability. When what is expected actually occurs, when the pattern holds, the mind receives confirmation that its model of the world is accurate. This confirmation is satisfying in a subtle way, not exciting, but reassuring. The identity has proven itself predictable, which, in the context of recognition, is a virtue rather than a limitation. It can be counted on to behave as it has always behaved, to look as it has always looked, to remain consistent across time and context. This reliability is the substance from which trust is made, the evidence that accumulates until the mind concludes. This can be trusted to remain itself. Breaking expectations draws attention because the mind is alert to pattern violations. When something appears different than expected, cognitive resources are immediately mobilized. The brain needs to determine whether the difference matters, whether it signals danger or opportunity, whether the mental model needs updating. This attention is not always desirable. While it can be useful for creating impact or signaling change, it also disrupts the smooth flow of recognition. The viewer must pause, recalibrate, work to understand what has changed and why. In contexts where the goal is effortless recognition rather than active engagement, broken expectations create friction rather than value. Attention is not always the goal, particularly for identities that serve functional rather than expressive purposes. Some brands need to be recognized quickly and then fade into the background, supporting an experience rather than dominating it. A payment system, a utility provider, a software interface. These identities often work best when they do not demand attention, when they can be identified at a glance, and then ignored while the user focuses on their actual task. For these identities, invisibility after initial recognition is success. They have done their job when they are noticed just enough to be recognized and trusted, then step back to let the actual product or service take center stage. Some identities are meant to fade into the background, to become part of the infrastructure of daily life rather than objects of ongoing attention. They establish themselves clearly enough to be recognized when needed, then recede into the familiar landscape, like the design of a doorknob or the layout of a keyboard. They become so familiar that they disappear from conscious awareness while remaining perfectly functional. This background presence is not a failure of impact. It is a particular kind of success, appropriate for identities whose purpose is to support rather than to perform, to enable rather than to entertain. Background presence can feel supportive in ways that foreground presence cannot. When an identity operates from the background, it provides stability without demanding energy. It is there when needed, available for reference, ready to signal recognition and trust, but it does not insist on being seen, does not compete for attention, does not add to the cognitive load that daily life already imposes. This supportive presence creates a sense of infrastructure, of something reliable that undergirds experience without overshadowing it. The identity becomes part of the environment, a steady element in the landscape that can be counted on to remain in place, to function as expected, to serve its purpose without fanfare. So the reassurance of consistency builds familiarity through repeated confirmation of expectations, through patterns that the mind detects and relies upon. Audiences observe these patterns over time, forming expectations that, when met, generate trust. Breaking expectations draws attention, but attention is not always desirable. Some identities serve best by fading into the background once recognized, providing supportive presence rather than demanding ongoing engagement. The identity establishes itself clearly enough to be known, then allows that knowledge to settle into the unconscious infrastructure of daily experience. It remains available, recognizable, trustworthy, without needing to constantly announce itself. The background becomes a position of strength, a place from which the identity can support, experience, reliably, consistently, and with the quiet confidence of something that knows exactly what it is and what it is for. Multisensory presence. Identity can exist without persuasion, without any attempt to convince or convert. Not all identities are designed to sell, to advocate, to change minds or behaviors. Some simply exist as markers, as points of reference, as ways of identifying what something is, without making claims about why it matters. These identities perform a taxonomic function, categorizing and labeling rather than promoting or persuading. They say, this is what this is called, this is how it can be recognized, this is where it belongs in the landscape of options. There is no pitch embedded in the identity, no argument being made, no appeal to desire or aspiration. The identity simply presents itself as fact rather than as proposition. Quiet presence can be effective precisely because it does not trigger the resistance that persuasion often provokes. When an identity is not trying to sell something, when it is not making demands or claims, audiences can encounter it without defensiveness. There is nothing to argue with, nothing to reject, nothing that requires skeptical evaluation. The identity is just there, existing in the world, available to be recognized without requiring any particular response. This lack of pressure creates space for organic relationship to develop, for familiarity to build naturally, rather than being forced through repeated persuasive attempts. The quiet identity accumulates presence gradually, becoming known through patient existence rather than through aggressive promotion. Brand identity is not only visual, though visual elements often receive the most explicit attention. Identity operates across multiple sensory channels, creating impressions that are seen but also heard, sometimes even felt or smelled. The totality of these sensory experiences contributes to how an identity is perceived and remembered. A brand might have a distinctive sound, a particular kind of music in its retail spaces, a signature audio logo, a characteristic way its name is pronounced in advertisements. These sonic elements become part of the identity just as surely as colors and logos do, triggering recognition through the ear rather than through the eye. Sound can be part of identity in ways both obvious and subtle. A restaurant might be known for the specific playlist that always fills its space. A product might make a distinctive noise when opened or activated. A brand's advertisements might consistently feature a particular style of music or voice. These sounds become associated with the brand through repetition, linking themselves to the visual identity and reinforcing recognition across sensory modes. When the sound appears, it carries the brand with it, triggering the same patterns of recognition that visual elements trigger. The identity becomes multisensory, present in the ear's memory as well as in the eyes. Pacing can be part of identity, contributing to the overall sense of what a brand is and how it operates. Some identities move quickly, fast cuts in videos, rapid speech in advertisements, quick transitions between ideas. Others move slowly, long, contemplative shots, measured speech, generous pauses between statements. This pacing communicates something about values and priorities. Fast pacing suggests energy, efficiency, urgency. Slow pacing suggests thoughtfulness, care, deliberation. The rhythm becomes recognizable, becomes part of what makes the identity distinctive. Audiences begin to anticipate the pace, to expect the particular tempo that the brand consistently maintains. Silence can be intentional, can carry meaning just as sound does. A pause in speech, a moment of quiet in a video, an absence of background music, these silences are not empty, they are full of intention. Silence creates emphasis, drawing attention to what comes before or after it. Silence creates space for reflection, for absorption, for the mind to process what it has received. Silence communicates confidence, the assurance that not every moment needs to be filled, that the message is strong enough to withstand gaps and pauses. An identity that uses silence well demonstrates control over its own expression, shows that it is not afraid of emptiness or quietness. Identity can be experienced passively, absorbed through repeated exposure rather than through active study or engagement. Most people do not sit down to learn a brand identity the way they might learn a language or a skill. Instead, they encounter it repeatedly in the course of living their lives, and through these encounters, the identity seeps into awareness. The absorption happens automatically, as a side effect of other activities. Someone shops, and in the shopping, encounters the identity. Someone scrolls through media, and in the scrolling sees the logo, the colors, the typeface. These passive exposures accumulate, building recognition without requiring deliberate attention or effort. Passive recognition still accumulates, still builds the familiarity that makes future recognition easier and more certain. The fact that attention was not fully focused during the exposure does not prevent the impression from being stored. The mind is constantly processing information at multiple levels simultaneously, and much of what it learns is learned peripherally through background awareness rather than foreground attention. An identity that is encountered repeatedly in this passive way still establishes itself in memory, still creates the neural patterns that enable quick recognition. The accumulation happens quietly, unconsciously, but it happens nonetheless. Time strengthens consistent signals because memory is built through repetition across temporal distance. A signal seen once makes a faint impression. A signal seen twice begins to form a pattern. A signal seen dozens or hundreds of times over months and years becomes deeply embedded. The temporal dimension matters. It is not just the number of exposures, but their distribution across time that determines strength of memory. An identity that maintains consistency over years builds recognition that is robust, durable, resistant to interference from competing signals. The long relationship with the identity creates deep grooves in memory, pathways that are easy to access and difficult to disrupt. Inconsistency creates friction because it forces the mind to do extra work. When an identity appears differently each time, the mind cannot rely on the patterns it has begun to form. It must re-evaluate, must Determine whether this is the same thing encountered before or something new. Is this the same brand with a different look or a different brand entirely? The ambiguity creates cognitive effort, slows recognition, introduces uncertainty. Each inconsistent presentation weakens the overall pattern, makes the identity harder to learn and remember. The mind is trying to form a stable mental model, and inconsistency prevents that model from solidifying. So identity extends beyond the visual into sound, pacing, even silence, each element contributing to the overall impression that defines how something is known. It can exist without persuasion, can be effective through quiet presence rather than aggressive promotion. The identity is experienced passively in the flow of daily life, accumulating in memory through repeated encounters that require no focused attention. Time strengthens what is consistent, embedding signals deeply in memory through years of reliable repetition. Inconsistency works against this process, creating the friction that makes recognition effortful rather than automatic. The identity builds itself through patient, multisensory presence, through showing up the same way across time and context, through allowing familiarity to develop at its own natural pace without forcing or rushing the process. What is consistent becomes known, and what is known becomes trusted, and trust enables the quiet, enduring presence that some identities achieve. Comfort and safety. Friction increases effort, and effort is a cost that accumulates with each interaction. Every moment of confusion, every instance of uncertainty, every need to stop and figure something out, these small frictions add up. An identity that creates friction makes itself harder to engage with, harder to remember, harder to trust. The viewer must work to decode what they are seeing, to reconcile inconsistencies, to update their understanding each time something appears differently. This work is not dramatic or overwhelming in any single instance, but across dozens or hundreds of encounters, it becomes a burden. The cumulative effort required to engage with an inconsistent identity eventually outweighs the benefit of engagement, and audiences begin to disengage, to look elsewhere for experiences that demand less of them. Reduced effort improves comfort because the mind naturally gravitates toward what is easy. Ease is pleasurable in a quiet way, a relief from the constant demands that life makes on attention and cognition. When an identity reduces effort through clarity, consistency, simplicity, it makes itself more comfortable to be around. There is no struggle to understand, no challenge to overcome, no puzzle to solve. The identity is simply there, clear and available, requiring nothing more than the passive act of recognition. This comfort may not be consciously registered, may not rise to the level of explicit appreciation, but it influences behavior nonetheless. People return to what is comfortable, what requires less of them, what allows them to conserve their cognitive resources for things that truly need attention. Identity does not need explanation when it is working well. It communicates through its own presence, through the patterns it establishes, through the associations it builds over time. An identity that requires constant explanation, that needs to tell people what it is, what it means, what it represents, has not yet succeeded in making itself clear through its own elements. The need for explanation signals that the visual, verbal, and experiential components are not yet speaking clearly enough, are not yet creating the immediate recognition and understanding that a mature identity achieves. The strongest identities explain themselves through repetition and consistency, becoming self-evident through accumulated experience rather than requiring supplementary text or verbal guidance. Explanation can interrupt experience, pulling attention away from direct encounter and into analytical thinking. When someone must read about an identity in order to understand it, they are no longer experiencing it directly, they are experiencing a description of it. This shift from direct to mediated experience changes the relationship, introduces distance, converts immediate impression into intellectual comprehension. For many identities, this interruption works against their goals. The identity wants to be felt, sensed, recognized, not analyzed or explained. It wants to work on the level of immediate perception rather than on the level of conscious thought. Explanation forces the experience into the cognitive realm, when it might be more powerful in the perceptual or emotional realm. Some identities are felt rather than described, operating primarily through sensory and emotional channels rather than through language. These identities create atmospheres, moods, felt senses that are difficult to capture in words. They might evoke warmth or coolness, energy or calm, luxury or accessibility, but these qualities are experienced directly rather than understood conceptually. Trying to describe such identities can actually diminish them, can reduce the richness of the felt experience to a limited set of verbal labels. The identity's power lies in what it makes people feel when they encounter it, not in what can be said about it afterward. Subtle cues often go unnoticed consciously, operating beneath the threshold of explicit awareness. A slight adjustment in color temperature, a small change in letter spacing, a minor shift in tone, these subtle elements might not register as distinct observations, might not be something a viewer could point to and name, but they contribute to the overall impression nonetheless, shaping how the identity feels even when they are not consciously perceived. The subtlety is strategic. These elements do their work without drawing attention to themselves, without becoming objects of analysis. They influence perception while remaining invisible as individual components. Unnoticed cues still shape perception because the mind processes far more information than it brings to conscious awareness. The visual system registers tiny variations in color. The auditory system detects minute changes in tone. The overall perceptual apparatus absorbs details that never become explicit thoughts. These unnoticed inputs feed into the overall impression, the felt sense of what something is like. An identity can be shaped as much by these subtle, unnoticed elements as by the obvious, prominent ones. The cumulative effect of many small cues can be more powerful than a few large ones, precisely because subtle cues work beneath the level where skepticism and analysis operate. Identity can support a sense of safety, can create environments that feel predictable and therefore secure. When an identity is consistent, when it behaves the same way repeatedly, it removes a source of uncertainty from the world. People know what to expect, know what they will encounter, know that the experience will match their prior experiences. This predictability is comforting on a deep level. In a world that often feels chaotic and unpredictable, consistent identities offer small islands of reliability. They create spaces, physical or psychological, where things are known, where patterns hold, where the future resembles the past. This sense of safety is not about physical security, but about cognitive and emotional comfort, about the relief of encountering something familiar in a sea of constant change. Safety encourages return because people naturally gravitate toward what feels secure and predictable. When an identity has established itself as safe as consistent, reliable, unlikely to surprise or disappoint, it becomes a destination people return to. The return might be physical, as in visiting a familiar store. It might be psychological, as in seeking out a familiar brand when making a purchase decision. Whatever form it takes, the return is motivated by the comfort that comes from knowing what to expect. The identity has proven itself trustworthy through repeated, consistent behavior, and that trustworthiness makes it a natural choice when familiarity is desired. Return builds familiarity in a reinforcing cycle. Each return provides another encounter, another exposure, another opportunity for the identity to impress itself on memory. And each exposure makes the next return more likely because the familiarity continues to deepen, the sense of knowing continues to strengthen. The identity becomes increasingly embedded in the viewer's life, increasingly part of their regular landscape of options and choices. What began as conscious selection eventually becomes habitual preference, becomes the default choice that requires no deliberation. The cycle of return and familiarity feeds itself, creating stability and longevity for identities that can maintain consistency across years and decades. So the reduction of friction and effort creates the comfort that makes engagement easy and natural, that allows the identity to be experienced rather than analyzed. Subtle, unnoticed cues shape perception as powerfully as obvious elements, working beneath conscious awareness to create overall impressions. Consistency supports a sense of safety that encourages return, and return deepens familiarity in a self-reinforcing cycle. The identity that succeeds in this way becomes woven into the fabric of daily life, becomes a reliable presence that people count on and gravitate toward. It does not need to explain itself because it has explained itself through years of consistent presence. It does not need to demand attention because it has earned the automatic recognition that comes from deep familiarity. The identity simply exists, steadily and reliably, in the place it has always occupied, ready to be encountered again and again by those who have learned to recognize it without effort, patience, and longevity. Familiarity supports longevity because what is known tends to endure. New things arrive constantly, competing for attention, promising novelty and excitement. But most of these new things fade quickly, replaced by the next wave of novelty. What lasts is what becomes familiar, what embeds itself deeply enough in memory and habit that it survives the churn of constant change. An identity that has achieved true familiarity has built something durable, something that can weather shifts in trends and tastes. The familiarity itself becomes protective, insulating the identity from the forces that sweep away less established presences. People return to what they know, and in that returning, they sustain what they have come to recognize. Longevity comes from steadiness, from the patient maintenance of consistency across time. An identity that constantly reinvents itself may generate attention in the short term, but struggles to build the deep recognition that sustains presence over decades. Steadiness allows patterns to form and solidify, allows audiences to learn the identity so thoroughly that it becomes part of their mental infrastructure. The identity that looks roughly the same today as it did 10 years ago, that will look roughly the same 10 years from now, is building longevity through this temporal consistency. Time itself becomes an ally, each passing year adding weight and substance to the identity, deepening its roots in collective memory. Brand identity evolves slowly when it evolves well. The strongest identities do not remain completely static. They adjust to changing contexts, incorporate new capabilities, refresh elements that have become dated. But these changes happen gradually, almost imperceptibly. The identity shifts by degrees rather than by dramatic leaps. A color palette might be subtly refined. A logo might be gently simplified. A tone of voice might be carefully modulated. These slow evolutions allow the identity to remain current without sacrificing recognition. Audiences can follow the changes, can update their mental models incrementally, can maintain continuity even as the identity transforms around them. Sudden changes feel disruptive because they break the pattern that audiences have learned to rely on. When an identity changes dramatically overnight, a complete visual overhaul, a total shift in tone, an entirely new direction, it asks audiences to discard what they have learned and start fresh. This demand is jarring. The familiar has become unfamiliar. The known has become unknown, and the mind must scramble to re-establish its bearings. Some audiences will make this adjustment, will learn the new identity and accept the change, but others will feel alienated, will experience the change as a loss, will mourn the familiar identity that has disappeared. The disruption creates fracture in the relationship, introduces doubt about stability and reliability. Gradual shifts feel intentional, feel like natural growth rather than arbitrary change. When an identity evolves slowly, the changes seem to arise organically from what came before. There is continuity in the transformation, a visible connection between past and present. Audiences can see the logic of the evolution, can understand how the identity has grown while remaining essentially itself. This sense of intentionality conveys respect for what the identity has been and care for what it is becoming. The gradual shift suggests thoughtfulness, planning, a long view that values both heritage and progress. It demonstrates that the identity is tended carefully, that changes are considered rather than impulsive, that evolution serves the identity's long-term health rather than short-term novelty. Identity reflects accumulated decisions, the sum total of thousands of choices made over time. Each decision about color, type, language, imagery, tone adds to the whole. Some decisions are large and strategic, setting foundational directions that guide everything else. Others are small and tactical, determining how principles get applied in specific situations. But all of them accumulate. All of them contribute to the identity that eventually emerges. The identity is not a single thing that was designed once and then implemented. It is an accretion of choices, building layer upon layer until a recognizable whole takes shape. Every decision either reinforces the existing pattern or introduces variation, either strengthens consistency or creates inconsistency. Observation matters more than rules in understanding how identity actually works. Rules can guide decision-making, can provide frameworks for maintaining consistency, but the real test of an identity is how it is observed and experienced by audiences. Does it feel consistent even if some applications technically violate the guidelines? Does it feel coherent even if it includes elements that were never explicitly planned? The identity exists in perception, not in documentation. What matters is what people actually see and sense and remember, not what the brand guidelines say they should see. Observation reveals the truth of the identity, what is actually being communicated, what is actually being recognized, what is actually creating the impression that audiences carry away. Identity benefits from patience because recognition cannot be rushed. The work of building familiarity takes time, requires repeated exposures distributed across months and years. An identity launched today will not be fully established tomorrow, no matter how brilliant its design or how intensive its promotion. The mind needs time to absorb, to learn, to integrate the new patterns into its existing framework of knowledge. Patience allows this natural process to unfold at its own pace, without forcing or rushing. An identity that is patient enough to maintain consistency through the vulnerable early period when recognition is still building, when the patterns are not yet fully established, gives itself the best chance of eventual success. Quiet identities are often underestimated because they do not create the immediate impact that louder approaches generate. A quiet identity does not announce itself dramatically, does not demand to be noticed, does not create the kind of attention that gets discussed and celebrated. In the short term, it can seem less effective than more aggressive alternatives. But quiet identities often prove their value over longer time horizons. They build slowly, accumulate steadily, and endure persistently. They do not burn brightly and fade quickly. They glow steadily and last indefinitely. The underestimation comes from judging them on criteria. They were never designed to meet immediate impact, dramatic visibility, instant recognition. Their actual strength lies elsewhere, in sustainability and longevity, and the deep trust that comes from reliable presence. Understated presence can endure precisely because it does not exhaust attention or wear out its welcome. A loud, insistent identity can become tiresome over time, can feel intrusive or overwhelming with repeated exposure. But an understated identity remains tolerable, even welcome, no matter how often it is encountered. It does not demand more than it needs, does not impose itself aggressively, does not create the fatigue that comes from constant intensity. This restraint gives the identity staying power. It can be present frequently without becoming annoying, can maintain visibility without becoming overwhelming. The understated approach trades immediate impact for long-term sustainability, choosing endurance over flash. So, familiarity, built through steady consistency, creates the longevity that allows identities to persist across years and decades. Evolution happens slowly when it happens well, through gradual shifts that feel intentional rather than disruptive. The identity emerges from accumulated decisions, understood best through observation of how it actually functions in the world. Patience allows recognition to build at its natural pace, and quiet, understated approaches often prove more durable than loud ones. The identity that endures is the one that builds carefully, evolves thoughtfully, and maintains the consistency that allows familiarity to deepen into lasting presence. Time becomes an asset rather than an obstacle, each passing year strengthening rather than weakening the bonds of recognition and trust that connect the identity to those who have learned to know it. Effortless permanence. Identity can exist without effort, not in the sense that it requires no work to create, but in the sense that once established, it simply is. The identity no longer needs constant tending, constant reinforcement, constant explanation. It has settled into place, has achieved the stability that comes from deep familiarity and consistent application. The work of maintaining it becomes lighter, more automatic, less deliberate. Decisions align naturally with established patterns. Applications feel obvious rather than uncertain. The identity has achieved a kind of equilibrium, a state where it can exist and function without requiring the intense attention and effort that characterized its earlier stages. It persists through its own momentum, through the inertia of patterns that have become deeply ingrained. Sometimes identity simply remains. There is no drama in this remaining, no story of triumph or struggle. The identity is there because it has always been there, because nothing has come along to displace it, because it continues to serve its purpose adequately. It remains through steadiness rather than through brilliance, through reliability rather than through reinvention. The remaining is not passive or accidental. It is the result of all the accumulated choices and consistencies that have allowed the identity to take root and hold its ground. But from the outside, it can look effortless, can seem as though the identity simply exists as a natural fact rather than as something that had to be built and maintained. Brand identity evolves slowly, and this slowness is not a limitation but a feature. The gradual pace of evolution protects what has been built, ensures that changes do not outpace the audience's ability to follow and adapt. It allows the identity to incorporate new elements and shed outdated ones without losing the thread of continuity that connects past to present to future. The slow evolution demonstrates respect for what the identity has become, acknowledgement that the accumulated recognition and trust are valuable assets that should not be squandered through hasty transformation. Each small change is tested against the existing whole, evaluated for how well it integrates, how naturally it fits, how much it preserves or disrupts the patterns that audiences have learned. Sudden changes feel disruptive not only in the moment they occur, but in the aftermath, as audiences must navigate the gap between what was and what now is. The mental model built through years of observation no longer matches reality. The shortcuts that made recognition automatic no longer work. The expectations formed through consistent experience are suddenly invalid. This disruption requires adjustment, demands cognitive work, creates a period of uncertainty during which the relationship between audience and identity is less stable, less comfortable, less reliable. Some identities can weather this disruption, can make the case that the change was necessary and ultimately beneficial, but the disruption itself is real, and its cost must be weighed against whatever benefits the change brings. Gradual shifts feel intentional because they allow observers to see the thinking behind the change, to understand the direction and purpose, rather than just experiencing the shock of difference. When an identity changes slowly, the arc of evolution becomes visible. People can see where things are heading, can adjust their understanding incrementally, can participate in the transition rather than just being presented with a fait accompli. This visibility of process creates a sense of partnership, a feeling that the identity is being stewarded thoughtfully rather than manipulated arbitrarily. The gradual shift invites audiences along on the journey, rather than asking them to simply accept a new destination. Identity reflects accumulated decisions, and in the reflection it reveals priorities and values. What has been emphasized repeatedly becomes clearly important. What has been neglected or excluded also tells a story. The pattern of decisions over time creates a record that can be read, interpreted, understood. This accumulated record is the true identity, not the intentions documented in brand guidelines, not the aspirations expressed in strategy documents, but the actual, observable pattern of what has been chosen again and again in practice. The identity is what it has done, what it has consistently been, what it has shown itself to be through countless small actions. Observation matters more than rules, because rules describe intentions, while observation captures reality. A brand might have guidelines that specify exactly how the logo should appear, what colors are permitted, what tone should be maintained. But if the actual applications consistently deviate from these guidelines, if the identity as observed differs from the identity as documented, then the observed version is the real one. It is what audiences see and experience and remember. The guidelines describe an ideal, but observation reveals what actually exists in the world. And what exists in practice, what shows up repeatedly in actual encounters, is what shapes perception and builds recognition. Identity benefits from patience because meaningful recognition accumulates slowly and cannot be accelerated beyond natural limits. The mind learns at its own pace, integrates new information according to its own rhythms. An identity that expects instant recognition is expecting something that cognitive processes simply cannot deliver. The patterns must be encountered multiple times, must be seen in varied contexts, must be stored and reinforced through repetition over weeks and months. Patience honors these natural learning processes, allows them to unfold without pressure or forcing. The patient identity understands that it is planting seeds that will take time to germinate, that will eventually grow into the deep roots of lasting recognition, but only if given the time they need. Quiet identities are often underestimated because the metrics by which identities are typically judged favor the loud and obvious. Immediate awareness, share of voice, cultural conversation. These measurements privilege identities that generate attention and discussion. A quiet identity does not perform well on these measures, at least not initially. It builds its presence slowly, through repeated exposure rather than through viral moments. Its strength shows up in different metrics: consistency of application, depth of familiarity among core audiences, longevity of presence. But these are harder to measure, slower to manifest, less impressive to those who equate effectiveness with visibility. The quiet identity accepts this underestimation, knowing that its value lies elsewhere, in domains that reward patience and consistency rather than flash and volume. Understated presence can endure because it never overextends, never promises more than it can sustain, never demands more attention than it deserves. The understated identity knows its proper scale, occupies its appropriate place, maintains the boundaries that keep it from becoming excessive or tiresome. This restraint is strategic, a conscious choice to build for longevity rather than for immediate impact. The identity that understates its presence can maintain that presence indefinitely because it never exhausts goodwill, never wears out its welcome, never creates the backlash that comes from being too much, too often, too insistent. It simply continues, year after year, present but not overwhelming, visible but not intrusive, there but not demanding. Identity can exist without effort once the foundation has been laid, once the patterns have been established, once the consistency has been proven over time. At that point, the identity operates almost automatically, recognized instantly, trusted implicitly, requiring no active promotion or explanation. And sometimes, identity simply remains not through constant reinvention or aggressive maintenance, but through the quiet persistence of what has proven itself reliable. The identity that remains is the one that has built slowly and carefully, that has evolved gradually rather than lurching dramatically, that has been observed to be consistent across countless encounters. It reflects the accumulated wisdom of decisions made thoughtfully over time, informed more by observation of what actually works than by adherence to abstract rules. It benefits from patience, succeeds through understatement, and endures through the simple act of remaining recognizably itself, year after year, encounter after encounter, always there, always steady, always ready to be known again by those who have learned to recognize it without thinking, without effort, without anything more than the passive act of seeing what has always been there to be seen. So the identity completes its arc, moving from initial establishment through gradual evolution to eventual permanence. It exists now not because it demands to exist, but because it has earned its place through consistency, patience, and the accumulated weight of reliable presence. The identity has become part of the landscape, part of the infrastructure of recognition, part of the stable background against which other things change and shift. It remains because it has always remained, because it has proven itself trustworthy through the simple act of being itself, again and again, without variation, without drama, without needing to prove anything beyond what years of steady presence have already demonstrated. The identity rests in the knowledge that it is known, that it will be recognized, that it occupies a secure position in the memory and awareness of those who have encountered it enough times to internalize its patterns. And in that security, it can simply be, existing without strain, persisting without effort, remaining without question. And so, the journey ends. Thank you for stopping by. If you're still awake, check out the Sleepy Time Design playlist.